The topic of this lecture is the Masque of the Red Death, and Poe's last published tale, Hop Frog, or the Eight-Chained Orangutans. And in between my remarks on these two stories, I'll say a few words about his poem, The Bells, as well. Readers may already be familiar with some of the literary sources for the Masque of the Red Death. One of these is the 14th century Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, in which characters flee the Italian city of Florence during the Black Death and pass time in a deserted villa, telling stories while waiting out the disease. Shakespeare's play The Tempest may have influenced Poe as well. I'll come back to that a little bit later in this video. But the most direct influence on the story was probably an article printed in 1832 by the successful magazinist Nathaniel Parker Willis, a friend and supporter of Poe. The article was part of a series of epistolary travel pieces titled Pencilings by the Way that recorded Willis's observations and impressions of various locations he'd visited across Europe and the Mediterranean. The 16th letter is a disturbing and graphic account of a cholera epidemic in Paris, which includes a description of a masquerade party very similar to the one hosted by Prince Prospero in The Masque of the Red Death. And I have an excerpt from the article on the right there. I was at a masked ball at the Théâtre des Variétés. There were some 2,000 people, I should think, in fancy dresses, most of them grotesque and satirical, and the ball was kept up till 7 in the morning with all the extravagant gaiety, noise, and fun with which the French people manage such matters. There was a cholera waltz, and one man, immensely tall, dressed as a personification of the cholera itself, with skeleton armor, bloodshot eyes, and other horrible appurtenances of a walking pestilence. It was the burden of all the jokes, and all the cries of the hawkers, and all the conversation, and yet, probably, 19 out of 20 of those present lived in the quarters most ravaged by the disease, and many of them had seen it face to face, and knew perfectly its deadly character. The Masque of the Red Death appeared 10 years later in Graham's magazine as a fantasy piece, perhaps because of the tale's unusual setting, which I'll talk more about later in the video. I've included the last page of the story to show how much thought went into organizing the contents of these magazines in which Poe published his work. Here, a gloomy apocalyptic finale of Poe's story is followed immediately by an optimistic Park Benjamin poem on the topic of spring, which also had the advantage of being long enough to fill the remaining space on the page. The decision may have been made by Poe himself, as he was co-editor of the magazine with George Rex Graham. He would leave the magazine after this issue. Poe's source for Hop Frog is beyond any doubt. In January 1845, the newly established Broadway Journal, a magazine Poe edited and later owned, published an article under the heading Barbarities of the Theatre, which includes a harrowing report of an accident at the Drury Lane Theatre in London, in which an actress, Miss Clara Webster, caught fire during the performance. Her gauze dress took fire from the footlights, we're told, and she was immediately enveloped in flames and ran about the stage, shrieking for help, avoided and shaken off by the other dancers at the peril of their lives, till the carpenter at the side scene rolled himself over her and extinguished the fire at the cost of great personal suffering to himself. She was taken home to die, and the play went on to the conclusion. The writer inserts a lengthy footnote here comparing Webster's death to a similar tragedy that took place during the 14th century at the court of King Charles VI of France, as recounted in Froissart's Chronicles. A friend of the king, Froissart reports, a gentleman of Normandy, devised 6 coats made of linen cloth covered with pitch, and thereon flax like hair. Thus arrayed in these said coats and sewed fast in them, they, that is, the king and his courtiers, seemed like savages, full of hair, from the top of the head to the sole of the foot. The king with the 5 others came in. They were so disguised in flax that no man knew them. 5 of them were fastened one to another. When they entered the hall, the Duke of Orleans was so desirous to know what personages the five were who danced, he put one of the torches that his servant held so near that the heat of the fire entered into the flax, and suddenly was on a bright flame. And so each of them set fire on one another. The pitch was so fastened to the linen cloth, and their shirts so dry and fine, and so joining to their flesh, that they began to burn, and to cry for help. None durst come near them. 4 of the 6 men died in this fire, as portrayed in the 15th century illustration of the Chronicles you see on the left. Unlike in Poe's story, the king, Charles VI, did not die. He was shielded from the flames by the Duchess of Berry, and you can see his head barely peeking out from under her dress in the far left of the illustration. Another courtier was able to extinguish the flames in a barrel of water, which you can see on the far right. I really like the detail of the frantically barking dog in the foreground who has no idea what to make of this. Poe wouldn't forget this story. 4 years later, it was the inspiration for Hop Frog, which appeared in The Flag of Our Union, and was the last tale Poe published in his lifetime. Before I talk about the Masque of the Red Death and Hop Frog individually, it's important to point to similarities between the two stories. While most of the tales we've read so far have had first-person narrators who are directly involved in the stories that they tell, these two stories are told in the third person. In the case of Hop Frog, there are some indications the narrator was a witness to the events of the story, even if he didn't participate in them directly. But he doesn't know all the details, like, for instance, whether Trippetta was indeed Hop Frog's accomplice in the immolation of the king and his counselors. So we can further say that he is a limited third-person narrator as opposed to the omniscient, all-knowing narrator of the Masque of the Red Death. But both these tales utilize third-person narration. The next similarity between the stories is their historical settings. Both tales seem to be set in a vaguely historical past, when princes ruled their lands capriciously with little regard for their subjects. There are scarcely any obvious allusions to contemporary events, no intrusion of modern fashions or technologies, and the third-person chronicler's voice seems to amplify this temporal estrangement. Next is noble protagonists. The central characters in both stories come from the nobility. There's the extraordinarily wealthy Prince Prospero in The Masque of the Red Death, and the unnamed king and his counselors in Hop Frog. Both these characters end up dead by the end of their respective stories. Next, revelrous events. Both tales involve lavish costume parties that become the very mechanism of appalling horror and death in both stories. Which brings me to the mass casualties. Finally, there are numerous deaths, hundreds in The Masque of the Red Death, and 8, the king and his 7 counselors in Hop Frog. Although we do not know the fate of the other revelers, since they've been locked in the grand salon or ballroom, and only Hop Frog has the keys to let them out, and he runs off at the end of the story after climbing out of the skylight in the ceiling of the room. I'm going to look at the stories now individually, starting with The Masque of the Red Death. And I'm going to look at important themes and motifs of these stories, as I've done in some of the other videos. First, I'm going to talk about art. I'm going to talk a lot about art, actually. And then, after that, alluding to the wild, weird climb described in Poe's poem Dreamland and its line, out of space, out of time, I'm going to talk about space and time in the story. So starting then with art, the protagonist of The Masque of the Red Death, the only named character in the story, is Prospero, probably named after Prospero in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Shakespeare's character is a kind of playwright and stage director himself, using magic to orchestrate illusions and control events on a remote desert island. From the beginning, it is clear that Poe's Prospero also is something of an artist. He's an architect, an interior designer and costume designer, among other things. His bizarre Gothic imagination, we're told, has even led some to question his sanity. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. The abbey in which Prospero hosts his revels, we're told, is an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. The mysterious colored chambers are his design, and I'll have more to say about them in a moment. He has also designed all the costumes for the masquerade. In Poe's description, notice his use of the adjectives grotesque and arabesque, which were in the title of his first collection of short stories 2 years earlier. It was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. This passage echoes a famous line in Shakespeare's The Tempest, when Prospero says, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." Sleep, by which he means death, and death is the rounding out of Poe's tale as well. So much of what's presented in the story, the architecture, the decor, the costumed revelers, including perhaps the phantom figure of death, is entirely fabricated by Prospero himself. It's tempting to read the entire tale as an elaborate allegory of the artist's imagination, like the haunted palace in The Fall of the House of Usher. The artist who creates beauty and music to avoid thinking about death, the ominous back room he tries to avoid, but of which he is inescapably reminded every time the clock chimes. So it was just a few months before he wrote this story that his consumptive wife, Virginia, while singing at the piano, suffered a severe hemorrhage in her lungs that caused her to expel a copious amount of blood from the mouth, a scene that would repeat itself numerous times until her death in 1847. Here's Poe's account of her illness and his attempts to cope with it in a letter to a friend. 6 years ago, a wife, whom I loved as no man ever loved before, ruptured a blood vessel in singing. Her life was despaired of. I took leave of her forever and underwent all the agonies of her death. She recovered partially, and I again hoped. At the end of a year, the vessel broke again. I went through precisely the same scene. Again, and about a year afterward. Then again, and even once again at varying intervals. Each time I felt all the agonies of her death, and at each accession of the disorder I loved her more dearly and clung to her life with more desperate pertinacity. But I am constitutionally sensitive, nervous in a very unusual degree. I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness, I drank God only knows how often or how much. As a matter of course, my enemies referred the insanity to the drink, rather than the drink to the insanity. I had indeed nearly abandoned all hope of a permanent cure when I found one in the death of my wife. Moving on now to the topic of space, Prospero's greatest artistic achievement, and without any question the most analyzed component of the tale, is the mysterious series of colored chambers that becomes the theater for his dreams. The apartments were so irregularly disposed, Poe writes, that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. The Gothic irregularity of the chambers and carefully contrived manipulation of visual perception seems intended to excite and perplex the imagination of anyone passing through them. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. There's much more to say about the color symbolism of these rooms, but I'm going to save that topic for class discussion and move on to the topic of time. The massive ebony clock that occupies the black chamber is the dominant symbol of the story, and its meaning is straightforward. Its brazen lungs sound clear and loud and deep, and the musicians and maskers are compelled to pause and heed this solemn reminder of the swift passage of time, especially at midnight, when there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. Poe writes, "It happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled." It is, of course, the tolling of midnight that heralds the arrival of the unknown intruder in the terrible guise of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. The chiming of the ebony clock and its symbolic function as a memento mori, a reminder of death, connects the tale to one of Poe's most popular poems, The Bells, which appeared in print for the first time just a week or two after his death in 1849. The earliest version of the poem dates to the spring of 1848, when it began as a playful collaboration with a female friend named Elizabeth Shue, who apparently suggested the topic to Poe when he complained of having nothing to write about. Over the next year, he expanded the poem into its present form, which finally appeared in John Sartain's Union magazine, taking up an entire page to itself. G.R. Thompson's note for the Norton edition of Poe's writings incorrectly states that it was published in December, but in fact it was the November issue, which was available to the public around mid-October. After Poe's death, publishers rushed to print whatever relics they had on hand, and Sartain printed a short early version of the poem in December. I'm not going to say much more about the poem here, since we'll discuss it in class in connection with the 7 colored chambers in the Masque of the Red Death, which brings me finally to the other tale we read, Hop Frog, perhaps the best title of all Poe's stories, The 8 Chained Orangutans. As I did with the Masque of the Red Death, I will organize my remarks around 3 major themes or motifs of the story, starting once again with art. I'm also going to talk about alcohol and finally revenge. Starting in with art, like Poe's Prospero, Hop Frog is something of an artist. We're told he was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costumes for masked balls that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. But Hop Frog is not a member of the nobility like Prospero. He's a slave to the king, like the deformed creature Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And while some critics see Hop Frog as a personal allegory of Poe's cold and contentious relationship with his stepfather, John Allen, others see it as allegorizing a sectarian and defamatory American literary scene that had long embittered Poe, making him resentful and sometimes recklessly hostile. Like Poe, Hop Frog uses his talent against his oppressors. These autobiographical interpretations are further supported by Hop Frog's susceptibility to alcohol. He was not fond of wine, we're informed, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes and took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink and, as the king called it, to be merry. We also saw this coerced intoxication in the Cask of Amontillado, although in that story it is part of Montresor's revenge on Fortunato. Here, it is the primary cause of Hop Frog's revenge against the king. So let's talk about that revenge. For it is the king's pressuring Hop Frog to drink, to toast to his absent family and friends from whom he had been abducted and forced into servitude, and above all, the maltreatment of his female companion, apparent love interest, and later his accomplice, the dancer Trippetta. And that motivates Hop Frog to revenge. I'm going to quote from the story here. Just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, Trippetta had just pleaded with the king, basically to leave Hop Frog alone. Just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, that odd noise was actually Hop Frog grinding his teeth, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, the 8-chained orangutans. It is such a ghastly revenge, however, that readers have been at odds on whether it is proportionate to the king's offenses. Aha, said at length the infuriated jester. I begin to see who these people are now. Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. We'll certainly talk more about this fiery finale in class and get your thoughts on whether it is a just revenge.